A cold Detroit night. A single streetlight flickers above a quiet block where young voices once rose into the winter air, blending harmony with hope. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it again, a smooth, aching tenor floating between the brick walls of Herman Gardens. It belonged to C.P. Spencer, a voice so pure and haunting that it helped define one of Motown's most soulful moments, yet somehow never received the recognition it deserved. How does a singer who led Baby I'm for Rail, one of the most beloved deep soul ballads of its era, become a hidden figure in the history he helped create? How does a voice that could stop a room fall into the shadows of the very legacy it helped build? Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from and be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. Long before C.P. Spencer ever stepped into a Motown studio or delivered the aching lead of Baby I'm for Real, he was simply a boy named craftsman Plato Spencer, growing up in the heart of Detroit. His story began in a city that was transforming as quickly as its young dreamers were growing. Detroit, with its hum of factories, bustling neighborhoods, and a thriving post-war black community, was a place overflowing with possibility, and music pulsed through every corner of it. Spencer was born into this atmosphere of sound and struggle. His neighborhood was a working-class landscape where families supported each other, where the church served as both spiritual refuge and cultural center, and where music was woven into the daily rhythm of life. Children gathered on stoops, harmonizing without realizing they were rehearsing for a future. Record players spilled doo-wop and gospel into open windows. Choirs rehearsed late into the evening. The world Spencer grew up in was noisy, vibrant, and full of soul. From a young age, he showed an unusual sensitivity to melody. While other children played games, Spencer listened, really listened to the way harmonies stacked, how voices blended, how a single emotional phrase could change an entire song. His early musical companion was Walter Gaines, a childhood friend who shared his passion. Together, they began doing what countless kids across Detroit were doing at the time, singing doo-wop on street corners, letting their voices drift into the night as neighbors paused to enjoy the sound. These street corner performances were more than pastime. They became a kind of training ground. Spencer learned how to project without shouting, how to hold a note steady even when the wind cut cold, and how to harmonize instinctively with others. Singing outdoors, exposed to whatever elements Detroit handed them, strengthened his voice and sharpened his discipline. Already, a natural lead tone began to develop, soft but sturdy, emotional without being fragile, a voice that made people stop and listen. By the time Spencer reached his teens, Detroit's musical world had begun expanding in remarkable ways. New labels were forming, young producers were experimenting, and local groups were emerging from every neighborhood. The atmosphere was one of constant creativity, and for young vocalists, the city functioned like an enormous open audition. If you were talented and determined, someone might notice you. It was during this period that Spencer first crossed paths with several young men who would become important figures not only in his life but also in Detroit's musical future. At Herman Gardens public housing, he met Billy Henderson, Henry Fambrough, Purvis Jackson, and James Edwards. They were just kids then, practicing harmonies in stairwells, learning songs by ear, pushing each other to be better. But these informal gatherings created an undeniable chemistry. In 1954, this group of friends officially formed their first vocal outfit, the Domingos. For Spencer, this was a formative experience, the first time his talent existed within a structured group, the first time he encountered group dynamics, blends, and responsibilities. Though he would leave the Domingos shortly after its formation, the impact of this early collaboration stayed with him. The Domingos would eventually evolve into one of Detroit's most beloved groups, the Spinners, but Spencer's path was destined to veer elsewhere. After stepping away from the Domingos, he reunited with Walter Gaines, and together they formed two short-lived acts, the Five Jets, and later the Five Stars. Neither group achieved commercial success, but both served a vital purpose. These were Spencer's apprenticeship years. He learned how to rehearse with intention, how to handle disappointment without giving up, and how to adapt to the shifting nature of group lineups. Each new group gave him a clearer sense of his identity as a vocalist, and affirmed that music wasn't just a hobby for him, it was his calling. Detroit, meanwhile, continued to evolve into the epicenter of soul music. Studios sprouted, Producers searched for the next big voice. Talent shows, small labels, and community centers became stepping stones toward professional careers. Spencer, with his warm lead vocal tone and quiet determination, was steadily moving toward the path that would ultimately define him, even if he couldn't yet see where it would lead. His early life was shaped by community, creativity, and a relentless desire to grow. He didn't have wealth. He didn't have connections. What he had was a voice. And in Detroit, sometimes that was enough to change everything. As P.Spencer moved into young adulthood, Detroit was no longer just the backdrop of his musical upbringing. It had become the proving ground where he would sharpen the skills that later defined him. But his rise was never the story of one group, one audition, or one lucky break. It was the story of a young man cycling through opportunities, disappointments, and small victories, each shaping the artist he was becoming. After leaving the Domingos, Spencer found himself in a transitional period, not lost, but searching. He and his childhood friend Walter Gaines refused to let their early momentum fade. Instead, they regrouped and formed the Five Jets, a modest doo-wop act, driven by raw talent and determination rather than industry backing. The group rehearsed tirelessly, refining harmonies, arranging songs, and performing at local gatherings. Spencer's voice stood out even then, a smooth, emotive tenor with a natural ability to convey vulnerability without losing strength. The Five Jets didn't chart, didn't sign big deals, and didn't make headlines. But they developed something far more important: discipline. The rehearsal rooms became classrooms, and Spencer was the kind of student who absorbed every lesson. He learned vocal control, stage presence, and the importance of blending personal expression with group cohesion. When the Five Jets dissolved, he and Gaines regrouped again, forming the Five Stars. The name suggested ambition, a desire to ascend, even if the group's reality was still rooted in Detroit's fiercely competitive music scene. They recorded one single for the Mark X label in 1958, a milestone that might have seemed small to outsiders but felt monumental to young musicians still trying to break through. The experience introduced Spencer to the world of studio work microphones, engineers, takes, retakes, and the precision required to turn emotion into a clean recording. This studio exposure became a turning point. Spencer realized that talent alone wasn't enough. To move forward, he needed collaborators with vision artists who shared his seriousness and passion. That opportunity arrived when he crossed paths with three young men who, like him, were striving for something bigger. Thank You Hunter, Lamont Dozier, and David Ruffin. Together, they formed the Voice Masters, a group that would quietly become one of the most important developmental chapters in Spencer's life. Unlike his previous groups, the Voice Masters operated with a clear sense of ambition. These were not just singers, they were future architects of soul music. Dozier would later become part of the legendary Dozier-Holland writing and production team. Ruffin would become the unmistakable lead voice of the Temptations. Thank You Hunter, a refined vocalist, would go on to join the Originals. In this environment, surrounded by talent that would soon reshape Motown itself, Spencer found the creative pressure he needed. The group rehearsed intensely, refining harmonies with a level of precision he had never encountered before. They pushed each other, corrected each other, and demanded excellence from every member. Spencer responded with a newfound confidence, sharpening his phrasing, tone, and emotional reach. Their efforts paid off when Gwen Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister, discovered them. She released their single Hope and Pray on her Anna label in 1960. The song earned local attention, and their follow-up single, Needed for Lovers Only, further cemented their reputation in Detroit's underground soul circuit. The Voice Masters weren't national stars, they weren't household names, but to be noticed by the Gordy family was significant. It meant they were operating in the orbit of greatness, and for Spencer, it meant he was finally being recognized not just as a doo-wop singer, but as a vocalist with genuine emotional power. This period was transformative. Spencer discovered his voice not as a background member, but as someone capable of delivering lead vocals with clarity and soul. He learned the art of restraint, the discipline of harmony, and the emotional courage required to connect with listeners deeply. By the time the Voice Masters began to drift apart, Spencer was no longer simply searching for his place. He was ready for a group, ready for a sound, and ready for a moment that would define the rest of his career. The next chapter would introduce him to that moment and to the group that would forever link his name to one of Motown's most beloved recordings. As the voice masters gradually went their separate ways, P.Spencer was left standing at a crossroads. Lamont Dozier moved fully into songwriting and production. David Ruffin stepped into the national spotlight with The Temptations. Thank You Hunter pursued his own opportunities. The departures could have felt like the end of a chapter, and in many ways they were, but for Spencer, they also marked the beginning of something far more defining. Spencer, Hunter, and Walter Gaines regrouped with a familiar face from earlier Detroit circles, Freddie Gorman, a deep-voiced singer and songwriter who, like them, possessed both hunger and quiet brilliance. Gorman had written for the Marvelettes. He had connections at Motown. And more importantly, he shared Spencer's belief that Detroit's vocal groups had something unique to offer beyond the polished formulas that were emerging. Along with tenor Hank Dixon, they formed a new quartet, the one that would become the Originals. This wasn't just another vocal group, it was a blending of rich personalities and seasoned experiences. Each member brought something different. Gorman's songwriting instincts, Hunter's silky phrasing, Dixon's versatility, and Spencer's heartfelt tenor that felt both tender and commanding at once. Yet even with this lineup, they still had to fight for recognition. When they first began submitting material to Motown, the label didn't quite know what to do with them. Motown was drowning in talent, the Temptations, the Four Tops, the Supremes, Martha and the Vandellas and newcomers, no matter how gifted, often landed somewhere in the background. The Originals were no exception. In fact, they were assigned primarily to backing vocal duties, lending harmonies to artists like Jimmy Ruffin, Stevie Wonder, and others. For most groups, this might have been discouraging, but for Spencer and his bandmates, the experience became another masterclass. They learned how to blend behind legendary voices, how to adapt to different production styles, and how to deliver precision under pressure. And all the while, Spencer was quietly refining the emotional technique that would later define him. Their real turning point arrived through someone who could see beyond their designation as background singers, Marvin Gaye. Gaye recognized something special in the way they blended, especially in Spencer's ability to convey vulnerability without breaking. He believed they had a sound worth showcasing, a soulful, honest timbre that didn't rely on flash or heavy orchestration. It was pure emotion. It was raw humanity. Marvin took them under his wing, carving out time in the studio, challenging them vocally, and helping craft material that suited their strength. Intimate, heartfelt ballads. He encouraged every member to sing lead, overturning the traditional Motown model where only one or two members carried the spotlight. This philosophy led to a moment that would define P.Spencer's legacy, the creation of Baby I'm For Real. It wasn't just another Motown single. It was a soft, aching confession delivered through four voices, each stepping into the lead with sincerity, but it was Spencer's voice that anchored the recording. His tender phrasing made the lyrics feel like truth. His delivery was both vulnerable and unwavering, a quality Marvin Gaye immediately recognized as extraordinary. And just like that, the young singer who once rehearsed under Detroit streetlights had arrived. His moment had come. The world was finally about to hear the voice that Detroit had known for decades, the voice of P.Spencer. When Spencer walked into the studio to record what would become Baby I'm For Real, he had no idea that he was stepping into the defining moment of his career. The atmosphere inside the room was quiet, but charged, the kind of silence that happens when a producer knows he's about to capture something timeless. At the center of it all was Marvin Gaye, calm and focused, guiding the Originals into a space where vulnerability became art. From the very first notes, it was clear the song was different. It didn't have the polished pop shine of many Motown hits. Instead, it opened with a soft, pleading intro that felt almost like a prayer. And then came the voice C.P. Spencer's voice, tender, aching, and impossibly sincere. It didn't matter that he wasn't a household name. In that moment, he sounded like someone who had lived every word he was singing. The structure of Baby I'm For Real also made it unique. Rather than centering on just one lead, Marvin insisted that every member of the Originals rotate the lead lines, creating a tapestry of voices that folded into each other. But it was Spencer's tone that set the emotional temperature. His opening phrases were soft enough to draw you in, yet strong enough to hold the entire song together. He delivered heartache without melodrama, longing without desperation. It was soul in its purest form, the kind that doesn't need embellishment to be felt. When the single was released, it stunned audiences and critics alike. Many listeners assumed it was Marvin Gaye singing background or even the lead, a misconception that spoke to the polished quality of Spencer's delivery. In reality, Marvin had simply shaped the song and encouraged the group. The emotional core belonged entirely to the originals. The track soared into the national charts, eventually becoming a million-selling record and marking the first major breakthrough in the group's career. For Spencer, it was validation, a moment that proved his years of persistence, setbacks, and quiet dedication had been worth it. He had stepped out of the shadows of Detroit's crowded soul scene and planted himself firmly into Motown history. Their momentum didn't stop there. Marvin stayed closely involved as the group recorded their follow-up single, The Bells, a haunting ballad built around another emotionally rich lead performance. Once again, Spencer's voice carried the song with a delicate balance of strength and vulnerability. The harmonies wrapped around him like a warm echo, creating an atmosphere that felt cinematic and deeply personal. The Bells climbed even higher on the charts than their previous hit, reinforcing what many insiders already knew. The originals were not just background singers, they were storytellers, vocal poets, a group capable of delivering emotional narratives with rare honesty. As applause grew and audiences began requesting the songs on radio stations nationwide, Spencer found himself experiencing something he had waited years for: recognition. His face appeared in promotional photos. His voice was finally being associated with the records he had poured himself into. And yet, there was still something quietly fragile about this success, as if he sensed that moments like this didn't always last. But for now, at least, the world was listening. And P.Spencer was exactly where he belonged, at the center of a sound that defined one of Motown's most soul-stirring eras. Even as Baby I'm For Real and The Bells filled radio playlists across the country, there was an unspoken truth lingering around the originals, a quiet understanding that their rise, as beautiful as it was, existed in the shadows of a label overflowing with giants. While audiences were beginning to recognize their sound, Motown's internal machinery still prioritized its headline acts. The originals were admired, respected, and undeniably gifted, but they were never pushed with the same force as the Temptations or the Four Tops. Still, during this brief but brilliant stretch, P.Spencer and his bandmates made the most of the spotlight they were given. Their live performances became moments of pure soul theater, Spencer standing at center stage, delivering lead lines with an honesty that felt almost sacred. He didn't perform for applause. He performed as if each lyric was a confession, a truth he needed the audience to feel with him. And they did. The originals recorded follow-up singles like We Can Make It Baby and God Bless Whoever Sent You, songs filled with warm harmonies, carefully layered arrangements, and Spencer's unmistakable emotional depth. Though these tracks didn't rise to the same chart heights, they carried a sincerity that later generations of soul collectors would cherish. Spencer, for his part, seemed to understand that while commercial success came and went, authenticity endured. But inside the group, the realities of the industry were becoming harder to ignore. Motown was shifting musically and geographically. New producers were arriving, new acts were taking priority, and the label's once intimate environment was expanding into something more corporate. For a group like the originals, whose sound thrived on intimacy and vulnerability, the change felt like a quiet tightening around their space to grow. Spencer sensed it. He had always been intuitive, attuned not only to music but to the emotional undercurrents around him. As their momentum began to slow, he felt the subtle pull toward uncertainty. Yet even then, he never lost the depth of his artistry. If anything, the challenges made his performances richer. Every time he stepped to a microphone, he sang with the awareness that success was fragile, that recognition was fleeting, and that the only lasting thing was the truth in his voice. In these years, the originals experienced both their greatest triumphs and the first shadows of decline. For C.P. Spencer, it was a peak built not on fame but on expression, a summit reached by heart rather than hype. And while the era of chart hits would eventually fade, the music he created during this period would continue to ripple through soul history long after the applause had quieted. As the applause began to soften and Motown's attention shifted toward newer, flashier acts, the momentum that had once carried the originals forward started to weaken. For P.Spencer, who had poured every piece of himself into the group's rise, the change was subtle at first. A delayed call here, a canceled session there, a new executive who didn't quite understand the delicacy of their sound. But slowly, the cracks became harder to ignore. Motown was evolving, and not always in ways that favored artists like Spencer. The label was moving toward a more polished, dance-oriented direction. The originals, whose strength relied on emotional ballads and warm harmonies, suddenly felt out of sync with the commercial tide. Where once the studio opened its doors eagerly for them, now scheduling sessions became a negotiation. Their music wasn't rejected, it was simply no longer prioritized. Inside the group, this shift began to stir quiet frustrations. Each member handled the disappointment differently, and while outwardly they maintained professionalism, inwardly they were grappling with the same painful question. Was their moment already slipping away? For Spencer, the answer carried more emotional weight than he expected. He had always been deeply connected to the group's artistic identity, the harmonies, the storytelling, the vulnerability that made their music feel intimate. But with fewer opportunities to record and dwindling promotional support, he found himself confronting the uneasy realization that their creative peak might have passed. There were also personal pressures. Years of navigating the industry had taken a toll. The demands of recording, touring, and trying to keep pace with Motown's ever-changing expectations created a tension that settled within him like a quiet ache. He was proud, deeply proud of what they had accomplished, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of being overshadowed by the label's marquee acts. The release of new singles that failed to chart only deepened his worry. Songs like We Can Make It Baby and God Bless Whoever Sent You carried the same craftsmanship and emotional depth as their earlier hits, but they received little support. Without the machinery of Motown behind them, even excellence struggled to reach the audience it deserved. By this time, Spencer began to feel increasingly distant from the path the group was being steered toward. The move into disco-oriented material, a direction the originals reluctantly adopted in hopes of staying relevant, didn't suit his artistic spirit. He respected the genre, understood its appeal, but it didn't match the emotional honesty that defined his voice. Singing over glossy, up-tempo arrangements felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. This creative mismatch widened the emotional gap between him and the music. Spencer had always believed that performing should feel like telling the truth. But now, as the group adjusted to a style they didn't fully connect with, that truth began slipping further away. The tensions weren't explosive. There were no dramatic confrontations or public fallouts. Instead, it was the quiet kind of conflict, the type that builds slowly, silently, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And eventually, C.P. Spencer reached a point of acceptance. The group he loved was moving in a direction he could no longer follow. The spotlight that once highlighted his voice had dimmed, and the home he found in the originals no longer felt like the same creative sanctuary. With a heavy but determined heart, he made the decision to walk away. When C.P. Spencer stepped away from the originals, he didn't slam the door behind him. His departure was more like a soft, closing the kind that happens when someone loves something too much to let it end angrily. And yet, even after walking away, music continued calling to him. It always had. It always would. A few years passed before Spencer made the decision to return to the group. Not because the industry had changed, not because Motown suddenly rediscovered them. He came back because the stage still felt like home, and because the harmony he once shared with his bandmates was something he couldn't find anywhere else. In 1978, he rejoined the originals, hoping to rekindle the artistic spark that had once carried them through their finest moments. They recorded new material, including 2 albums under the Fantasy label, and their voices blended with a maturity shaped by years of hardship and growth. But the world had changed. The music business had changed, and the sound that defined their early years, warm, emotional, deeply human, no longer aligned with the commercial gatekeepers of the time. The albums didn't chart the way they'd hoped. Radio barely took notice. Yet, even in this quieter era, there was a dignity in their work. They still sang with heart. They still meant every note. In 1981, The group released Yesterday and Today, a heartfelt tribute to Thank You Hunter, who had passed that year. For Spencer, the project carried enormous emotional weight. Thank You had been a partner in music, a brother in spirit, and a constant presence through the ups and downs of their journey. Recording that album felt like placing flowers at a gravesite, beautiful, necessary, and painfully final. After this period, Spencer's life gradually moved away from the spotlight. He was no longer chasing hits, no longer trying to fit into the shifting molds of the industry. Instead, he focused on living quietly, sharing his talent when opportunities felt right, and carrying with him the memories of the group that had shaped his identity. But behind the calm exterior, his health had begun to decline. Years of performing, traveling, and emotional strain had taken their toll. Friends recalled that even as his body weakened, his voice remained warm, still capable of reaching into the soul the way it had in his youth. On the 20th of October, 2004, C.P. Spencer passed away after a heart attack. His death didn't dominate headlines, didn't spark national retrospectives, didn't bring the music world to a halt. But for those who truly understood the depth of his artistry, the loss was immeasurable. A quiet man, a powerful voice, a legacy far larger than the recognition he received. His story was never one of fame. It was one of heart and heart. Unlike hit records, never fades. C.P. Spencer's legacy in American music is one of those rare stories where influence far outweighs visibility. To the casual listener, his name may not carry the same immediate recognition as the marquee stars of Motown. But to musicians, producers, collectors, and soul aficionados across the country, Spencer represents something far more valuable: authenticity. A singer who didn't chase fame, didn't mold himself to market trends, and didn't dilute his artistry for broader appeal. His legacy is the kind that grows slowly, deeply, and irrevocably over time. In American soul culture, Baby I'm For Real and The Bells are more than nostalgic favorites. They're pillars of a particular emotional language that Motown didn't often lead with. While the label became famous for polished, upbeat pop soul records, the originals with Spencer at the heart of their most iconic moments offered something different. Their music was intentional, reflective, vulnerable. Songs like these carved out space for intimate storytelling at a time when radio often favored infectious hooks over emotional truth. Within the United States, especially among Black communities who lived through Motown's golden era, Spencer's voice became a kind of shorthand for sincerity. When Baby I'm For Real played at barbecues, house parties, or late-night gatherings, people didn't just sing along, they felt it. Spencer's delivery captured a kind of emotional honesty that resonated deeply with listeners, especially adults navigating love, heartbreak, and reconciliation. His tone made everyday experiences feel cinematic. What makes his legacy particularly remarkable is that Spencer never dominated the spotlight. He didn't need to. His voice lived in the quiet spaces, the memories people kept, the records they didn't throw away, the conversations where someone would say, "You remember that song? That one hit different." His talent existed not in volume, but in permanence. American soul historians often point out that without the originals, and specifically without Spencer's vocal presence, Motown's catalog would feel incomplete. The label's emotional spectrum would be narrower, its storytelling shallower. Spencer helped give Motown dimension. He wasn't the face of the brand, but he was one of its beating hearts. DJs who specialize in classic R&B frequently include the originals in their grown folks sets, the kind of music reserved for listeners who appreciate subtlety over spectacle. Spencer's songs have been spun at family reunions, wedding receptions, and late-night slow jam radio segments for decades. And although younger generations may not always recognize his name, they recognize the feeling his records bring, the warmth, the sincerity, the ache. Within musician circles, Spencer is remembered with quiet reverence. Vocalists admire his control, his ability to communicate emotion without over-singing, his instinctive phrasing. Producers admire the way his voice sat inside a mix always present, never overpowering. And songwriters admire the way he could take a simple lyric and make it sound like lived experience. Even beyond Motown, Spencer's influence can be heard across American R&B. Neo-soul artists have cited the originals as inspiration, praising the group's minimalist arrangements and emotional storytelling. Modern vocalists study Spencer's tone, the way jazz musicians study phrasing not to imitate him, but to understand how purity and restraint can sometimes be more powerful than vocal acrobatics. In the United States, C.P. Spencer remains one of those artists who lived in the margins but shaped the center. His story may not be widely known, but his footprint is unmistakable. He changed the musical vocabulary of Motown, helped elevate the ballad form, and left behind recordings that continue to stir hearts long after the era that created them has passed. He may not have been the star that history spotlighted, but he was the voice that history remembers. Outside the United States, C.P. Spencer's voice found a second life and, in some places, a louder one. While American audiences often recognized his songs without knowing his name, international listeners, especially across Europe and the United Kingdom, embraced his work with a kind of devotion that surprised even longtime Motown insiders. It was as if the rest of the world heard something America had overlooked: the depth, fragility, and timelessness inside his voice. In the United Kingdom, the Northern Soul movement became a powerful force in keeping forgotten, overlooked, or under-promoted American soul alive. Spencer's recordings with the originals fit perfectly into that world, emotionally rich, rhythmically steady, and carried by a sincerity that Northern Soul audiences prized above all else. "Baby, I'm for real," and "The Bells" became cherished staples on turntables, dance floors, and late-night radio. Collectors treated original vinyl pressings as treasures. DJs spoke about Spencer with respect usually reserved for legends. European listeners, who often gravitated toward emotional storytelling rather than commercial trends, recognized the poetry in Spencer's delivery. His voice captured universal emotions: longing, hope, regret, devotion in a way that transcended regional styles. You didn't need to grow up in Detroit to understand him. You only needed a heart. In countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands, soul enthusiasts built entire communities around cataloging, preserving, and celebrating artists like Spencer. His songs were remixed, rediscovered, sampled, and studied. Even modern electronic producers found themselves drawn to the melodic purity of his work, weaving snippets of his recordings into contemporary tracks that introduced his voice to a new generation. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, the originals gained a cult-like legacy. For decades, Spencer's voice continued appearing on compilation albums, classic soul radio blocks, and DJ sets aimed at deep cuts-only audiences. Among connoisseurs, he wasn't an underrated singer, he was essential listening. Beyond Europe, Spencer's impact traveled even further. In Japan, a country known for its deep reverence of classic American soul, collectors actively sought the original's catalog. Specialty record shops proudly stocked their albums, and Spencer's voice became part of Japan's rich tradition of celebrating underappreciated Black American artists. His sincerity resonated across cultural lines, reminding listeners everywhere that the human heart is universal. What makes Spencer's global legacy so remarkable is that it never relied on hype. It grew naturally, passed from one listener to another, preserved by those who valued emotional truth over commercial success. In a world that often rewards the loudest voices, C.P. Spencer became an international favorite, precisely because he was the opposite: intimate, thoughtful, honest. Across continents and decades, his music proved something powerful: that a quiet voice, when filled with soul, can echo farther than anyone ever expected. When we look back at the life of C.P. Spencer, what emerges is not the story of a man who chased fame, but the story of a man who chased truth. His voice wasn't crafted for spectacle. It wasn't designed to dominate charts or to fit neatly into formulas. Instead, it carried a gentler, deeper purpose to make people feel something real. And in a world that often rewards volume over vulnerability, that alone makes his journey extraordinary. Spencer's path through the American music landscape was winding and often unfair. He never stood at the center of Motown's spotlight, even though his voice helped give the label some of its most emotionally resonant moments. His name didn't appear on billboards. He didn't headline national tours. Yet somehow, his voice traveled farther than many who did. It slipped quietly into living rooms, car radios, backyard gatherings, and late-night reflections. It found its way into memories people kept for a lifetime. It became part of the emotional DNA of soul music. The beauty of his story is that it reminds us how legacy actually works. Fame fades, trends shift, labels evolve. But the human heart, the place where music really lives, remembers sincerity. And sincerity is the foundation of everything P.Spencer ever sang. "Baby, I'm for real" remains one of Motown's most haunting declarations of devotion. The bells continues to echo with timeless longing. These songs didn't just mark a moment. They became emotional bookmarks in thousands of people's lives. Long after the industry moved on, listeners kept returning to his voice because it represented something pure, something unguarded, something honest. And perhaps that's the most meaningful part of his legacy. He proved that you don't have to be the loudest presence to leave the deepest impact. You don't need constant attention to create something immortal. All you need is truth, delivered with heart. Spencer offered that every time he stepped to a microphone. His later years lived more in quiet than spotlight. Do not diminish the power of what he gave. If anything, they highlight how deeply he believed in music as an expression, not a competition. He sang because he loved it. He sang because it was his way of surviving hardship and honoring joy. He sang because his voice was his gift, one he never withheld, even when applause grew faint. Today, as we revisit his story, we're not just remembering a singer, we're honoring a craftsman, a storyteller, a man whose voice carried the weight of lived experience. C.P. Spencer may not have lived to see the full appreciation he deserved, but his music continues to rise in value with every new listener who discovers it. And that is the quiet miracle of artists like him. Their legacy doesn't burn fast. It simmers. It grows. It endures. As this story closes, I invite you to take a moment to revisit his recordings, not just to hear them, but to feel them. Let his voice remind you why soul music matters, why honesty never goes out of style, and why even the most uncelebrated artists can leave marks that last longer than fame itself. Before we go, I want to hear from you. What is your favorite song by the originals, and what does C.P. Spencer's voice mean to you? If you believe stories like his deserve to be remembered, honored, and preserved, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue shining a light on the artists who shaped our world even when the world wasn't looking.